During my teenage years, I barely had memories of my dad. I know this sounds terrible, but it does tend to happen when you lose someone at a young age, even if it's a loved one. For what I remember, my dad was different from the rest of the people who lived in town. He was the black sheep in a good way, and I grew up to become that as well. The black sheep of the family, and eventually, the black sheep of the town. The problem with the place where I was born and where I lived for many years is that they seem to be stuck in time. They love to follow traditions no matter what kind. The children acted like an exact replica of their parents and other family members who have lived before. I know this might sound like I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. Our clothes came from the village. Our tools came from the village. We were not even allowed to read books or use anything that didn't come from the village. Most girls are told their place is in the house looking after children, cleaning, gardening, making clothes and such activities. Men have different occupations, but it's still not a wide range. Men could be fishermen, helmsmen, doctors, electricians, or own a store or a bar. Due to tradition, most boys and men are taken away on fishing trips without considering their wishes, physical and mental states. Without caring about the weather conditions, which led to a very tragic problem we had in our village. A problem known as the Curse of the Suns. The Curse of the Suns gained its name due to the large number of men who died during fishing trips. And I was lucky enough being a single child, because if I had a brother, I'm sure I would have ended up being the deceased one. You see, one of the random things about the so-called curse is that the brother who died always happened to be the weakest one. Causes of death varied. Some died because they suffered an asthma attack, some due to a storm. Others died because they fell off the boat. Others hurt themselves with objects, and of course, losing a battle against an animal was a very popular death as well. Extra points if it were a shark. My dad's cause of death, well, it was hidden from me. And as I said before, Dad was different from the rest. He didn't want to be a fisherman like everybody expected him to be. His biggest dream was to become a writer. But due to my town's traditions, every man in town has to go at least once a year on a fishing trip. Otherwise, they're forced to leave town, leaving everything else behind. The last time I saw him before his death was at the pier before he left his fishing trip duty. It was in 1986. I remember Dad's stories. He was so creative. In fact, Dad used to be one of the few people in town that knew how to read and write. As you might have guessed, there were no schools around. That, combined with the lack of focus in academics, leads to a very high percentage of illiteracy. Only the newer generations knew how to read and write. Luckily for me, Dad taught me how to do so. Before his death, he gave me plenty of books, some of them actually written by him. By the time Dad died, he had been working as the town's newspaper writer. He wasn't really earning money out of that, but at least he was doing what he liked. Something that I always thought was weird was that when Dad died, everybody acted so normal. I don't think I even saw my mom crying, but she's always been so insensitive anyways. She was the total opposite of my dad. I never really liked her. On the other hand, my grandma Pearl used to be very close to me, and once Dad died, she pretty much vanished out of my life. She still lived in the same place. She just avoided me every time she saw me. Whenever I went to her house, she definitely made sure the visits were brief. You could say that after Dad's death, I was alone, but it wasn't completely that way for too long. In a way, you could say that I lost a dad, but gained another one, for Uncle Joe suddenly became very close to me. Uncle Joe was Dad's twin brother. He was a fisherman, and all things opposite to that. He was strong and a total macho. Uncle Joe was that one person everyone admired. All men feared him, and all the ladies wanted him. He was by far one of the most respected people in town. Part of the popularity of Uncle Joe is due to his multiple fishing trips around the world. He was also the best fisherman the town ever had after Ernest Weiss, our town's most iconic fisherman ever, who had mysteriously disappeared by the same time my dad died. And even though Uncle Joe was very popular when it came to the ladies, he never did get married. His life was completely dedicated to his job and his equally popular crew, Lorenzo, Fabrizio Moretti, the Italian cousins that my uncle brought to town, and even though people here tend not to like outsiders, they completely accepted this pair. Mark Marshall's son of the popular Marshalls who owned the biggest supply store in town. All four of them were big and strong and definitely the type of men you don't want to get into trouble with. And Uncle Joe was the only person who comforted me when Dad died, and the only person I always felt I could speak to. Though, whenever I asked him about Dad's death, he always blamed the curse of the sons. And I never doubted Uncle Joe because how can you doubt someone who is technically a local hero? Whenever Uncle Joe came back from his trips, he brought me and my mom the freshest fish. He also used to break the rules, and whenever it was my birthday, he would smuggle books from another town and give them to me as a present. More than a nephew, he treated me more like a son. And everything seemed normal enough until 1996, 10 years after Dad's death. As Grandma Pearl was about to die, I was the only one in the room with her, for Uncle Joe wasn't back from one of his trips, and my mom had gone somewhere. Grandma Pearl asked me to forgive her, and of course, I was more than confused and expressed it to her. She then replied by saying, "I'm so sorry about you, Dad. That has always been my biggest regret. I shouldn't have let this happen. I'm sorry I grew distant from you. Every time I saw you, it's like he was there. And I've always had the feeling you will have the same fate." Those were Grandma's last words. Certainly, they woke something in me, a curiosity I never felt before. After Grandma's statement, I felt like absolute shit. I wanted those thoughts to go away, so I went to my favorite tavern in town, Hugo Helmets, one to drown my sorrows. Good old Hugo must have noticed because he came to me and asked me what was wrong. I trusted Hugo, so I told him what Grandma had said to me. Hugo didn't look surprised. He grabbed the beer for himself, which was actually very rare. He sat next to me and said, "Your dad, he was one of the good ones, but that was his problem. Nothing good ever happens to good people." But I was too drunk to understand his words. I didn't even pay attention to them at the time. And the next thing I remember is Hugo taking me to his house. A thing he always did when I was very drunk and didn't want my mom to see me like that. The next day I woke up on Hugo's sofa. I was awakened by Hugo's wife, who gave me a lovely breakfast afterwards. I felt so much better after that. But now, I felt so good. I started to remember what had been said last night. Hugo's words, Grandma's words. It was like all of a sudden, Pandora's box had been opened. I waited until Hugo woke up and then asked him about what he said. He brushed it off and said it must have been my imagination because we hadn't spoken about anything. And I knew Hugo was lying. He was a terrible liar. But I didn't want to be rude in the man's house, so I just shook his hand, thanked him and his wife, and I left. As I arrived to my house, I noticed my mom and uncle having breakfast together in our dining room table. The thing that took me by surprise the most wasn't that Uncle came so quickly from his trip, but that Mom's look was very, very unusual. She was wearing my uncle's favorite t-shirt, and her tidy curly hair was a mess. She wasn't even wearing a skirt or pants. I could see she was just wearing her underwear, and my uncle was shirtless and only wearing his underwear as well. I got a nervous high from my mom as she tried to cover herself up. My expression must have revealed my thoughts because my uncle immediately stood up and gave me a hug and said, "Sorry, Michael, it's been a difficult night, and after grandmother's death, you left the hospital without saying it. Your mom was really worried she drank too much wine last night and went looking for you in the rain. She got there and she looked quite bad. Well, I gave her my t-shirt so that she'd be warm." I wanted to believe he was being honest, but his tone was very different this time. He sounded almost as if he didn't give a shit whether I believed him or not. I sat down with him and joined him as he was having his breakfast, and Mom went to her room and got changed. As I was alone with my uncle, we started speaking about Grandma's funeral and burial plans that were going to be held the next day. Even if Grandma had basically dodged me ever since Dad's death, I couldn't help but cry. Although most of my tears were because I was so confused and anxious because of Grandma's last words. Uncle Joe, well, he didn't try to cheer me up like he would have done before. And he rolled his eyes at me and said I needed to calm down because there was something big coming. And when I asked him what it was, he mentioned my annual fishing trip. But those never excited me. In fact, I did everything I could do to always avoid them or postpone them despite always failing. Uncle Joe said my annual fishing trip was going to be held in a few days, which was very unusual because normally each man had their annual fishing trip on the day of their birthday. My trips were always on October 17th, and now he's telling me my trip was going to be on June 5th, just a couple of days away because of poor weather conditions. Call me crazy, but something definitely didn't add up. I told my uncle I didn't want to go, almost throwing a tantrum just like always. However, this time, he was determined. "We're going in 2 days, whether you like it or not," It's time for you to man up instead of acting like a pussy just like your dad, he said. It was the first time Uncle Joe spoke to me that way, which confirmed my suspect that there was something going on. Next day, it was Grandma's funeral. Many people were there, but I wasn't the most popular in town, so no one was really speaking to me. All condolences were exclusively directed to my mom and my uncle. My mom's friend, Genevieve, came to her, touched her belly, and stood to her all the time, but I didn't give it importance at the time. I felt overwhelmed by the mass, so I decided to go outside for a quick smoke. Luckily for me, Hugo was there smoking as well. I told Hugo about the sudden change of my fishing trip, and I immediately noticed his reaction was a little odd. I asked him what was going on, but he didn't answer. He just told me to go to his pub the following day at nighttime. So, the next day I waited anxiously the whole day until Mom and Uncle Joe were sleeping to go to Hugo's tavern. And to my surprise, there wasn't anybody but us there. As soon as I arrived, he proceeded to give me a newspaper that I quickly recognized. It was the one my dad used to write. I looked at the headline, which read, "The Curse of the Sons, the Shameful Tradition of Our Beloved Town." And I looked back at Hugo, and he gave me a nod and pointed at a chair inviting me to sit. The article revealed the truth behind the so-called curse. For many years, centuries in fact, people from our town had the belief that only one son should live. Every family decided which sons were the weakest, and during the fishing trips, they killed that son as a sacrifice to the god of the ocean. After killing them, they threw their bodies to the ocean. They believed doing this helped them bring more fish. And all adults were on board with this. Normally, the secret was revealed to the strongest sons, as they were 18 years old. According to my dad's article, the tradition kept going for so many years due to two things: ambition and fear. Some, of course, strongly believed in this, and some others, like many moms, for example, were threatened in order to let this happen. Hugo revealed yet another secret. Since Dad and Uncle Joe had no dad, there was no one that could choose between the two of them. The man of the house is the only one that always has to take this decision. They had no granddad either, so for many years they had no one to decide their fate. Grandma told both of them the truth about the sacrifice when they were 18, thinking that because there was no man in the house to choose between the two of them, none of them had to be killed. Both Dad and Uncle Joe kept living their lives. Eventually, Dad got married to Mom, who used to date Uncle Joe before Dad, and they had me. However, 6 years later, a new man arrived to the picture. That man was the one and only Ernest Wise, the town's local hero and best fisherman. Ernest started to date Grandma Pearl, and Uncle Joe was more than fascinated. His biggest role model was now his new dad, and nevertheless, my uncle's admiration for Ernest turned to hate when he found out Ernest had chosen him instead of Dad for the sacrifice. Uncle Joe always saw Dad as inferior to him, and he felt betrayed because his idol had taken this decision. Even though Joe was physically stronger, Ernest Wise considered mental strength was the most important one. Uncle Joe, hurt and resentful, created a master plan. Joe knew Dad was opposed to the town's traditions and decided to take advantage of Dad's new job as the newspaper writer. He convinced Dad to write an article publicly rejecting the sacrifice. And this, of course, was not well seen by the people. Many people tried to convince Ernest to change his mind about his decision and begged him to take my dad's life instead. The day came when Ernest took both of them to their annual fishing trip. Uncle Joe was convinced he'd live. Nevertheless, Ernest didn't change his mind and tried to sacrifice my uncle. Joe defended himself from Ernest by killing him, but that wasn't enough. He killed my dad as well. Hugo explained no one in town cared about this because, well, they hated my dad. And everybody, included my mom, were on board. The only exception was Grandma, who fell into depression and decided to be away from all of us. Hugo also told me Uncle Joe was no longer nice because things had changed. Hugo heard my uncle's drunk crew members saying my uncle was going to become a dad. Now, I understood the compromising scenario the day before. My mom was my uncle's lover. And that explains my mom's friend touching her belly and my uncle's attitude. I freaked out hearing this information. My life seemed so normal until now. I was a couple of days away of facing my own death, and I was going to end up like my dad, and like Ernest. I asked Hugo what could be done. He replied by saying we still had time to think about a plan to take my uncle out of the picture. And I was totally on board after all the troubles he had caused. And all of a sudden, we heard a loud bang. "There's no service tonight," Hugo screamed, but the person kept trying to open the door until they finally did it. And to our surprise, we found my uncle was the person that walked in. "Oh, Hugo, you're just like my brother. You never knew when to keep your mouth shut," he said as he threw a knife at him. Hugo screamed in pain and fell to the floor. He was bleeding all over the place. My uncle came to me and grabbed the newspaper out of my hands and hit me in the face with it. "You ungrateful piece of shit," he said. "You're just like your dad, aren't you? A weak scumbag. I'm tired of you. I've had enough." He continued as he grabbed another knife and was about to stab me in the heart. I closed my eyes and accepted my destiny. But after a minute of feeling nothing, I opened my eyes and saw the most heroic thing someone's ever done for me. Hugo had pulled the knife out of himself and stabbed my uncle in the back of the knee. Both of them were bleeding. I came to Hugo to offer my help, but he insisted he'll be fine, that we had to go get rid of Uncle Joe, because this was our only chance. I helped Hugo stop his bleeding and followed his instructions. He stabbed my uncle one more time at the back of his other knee so that he could not move. We covered his mouth with a tea towel and tied his body up with some ropes. Lucky for us, the streets were empty, so no one saw us. We dragged my uncle to a pier close to the town, the pier where I last saw my dad before he died. Once we got to the end of the pier, Hugo suggested we should throw my uncle to the ocean. However, an impulse came to me. Drowning wasn't enough for my Uncle Joe. My dad and Ernest were simply thrown to the ocean. They must have suffered and gave Uncle Joe a taste of his own medicine. I stabbed him 3 times, one for my dad, one for Ernest, and one for my grandma. Hugo and I threw him to the ocean and looked at him as we saw him going under. Hugo went to his house for his wife and daughter and all his belongings. They came back to the pier and said bye to me. Hugo told me that they were leaving to Malta and gave me an address and a telephone where I could contact him. They offered to take me with them, but I declined, stating that I wanted to follow my own path, and I had something else to do before going away. And I also told them I'd definitely send them a letter every so often. He gave me some money, and he left. I went back to my house and entered by the window, so that couldn't be seen or heard by my mom. I grabbed a bag and filled it with all the books that belonged to my dad. Before I left the house forever, I thought about killing my mom, but I ended up not doing it. I went back to the pier. It must have been 4 a.m. I grabbed my uncle's boat and left. Thanks to the money that my uncle had left on his boat, I lived for many years in the same place, and everything seemed to be fine, at least until now. I recently got a message on my phone from Nicolette, Hugo's daughter, informing me her dad has been killed. The message came with a picture, the picture of a letter addressed to me promising I'll be the next one. Letter signed by my uncle's crew, and a new name. A man with the same name as me. The son of my uncle and my mom. I know I should have killed Mom when I had the chance. And now, I have to be constantly moving to different places. And all I hope is for them not to come. Because I don't want to end up being the weakest son. The autumn leaves were orange and red, and danced in the cold breeze as the sun quickly disappeared under a cloud cover. The days were getting shorter and shorter, and I knew in time that winter would set in, and I would have to spend most of my time indoors. I hated spending all my time inside, all winter, and I wanted to get out and do things. I mean, really, just anything. So, high school just let out for fall break, and I never had anything to do with the breaks that we had. But I had an idea of what to do over break this time. I decided that I was going to go to this abandoned shack that I had come across while hiking in the woods one day. Shack, while not completely dilapidated, was still left to abandon. It was surrounded by bushes and trees, and all sort of ivy crawled up the outside walls. Luckily for me, it was only a few-mile hike from my house into the woods. I wanted to go in and explore the day I had found it, but I wasn't prepared. Plus, my mom called and said to get home because it was almost time for dinner. After I had dinner, I decided I was going to lie and tell my mom I was going to go to a friend's house for the night, and I grabbed my stuff and headed out the door. Now, I guess I didn't have to do this in hindsight. But I knew it was going to be a tough hike in the woods, and it would probably take a few hours. Come to think of it, I was feeling really good and confident that night, so hiking in the woods at night alone didn't cross my mind as a bad thing. I mean, really, but what could happen? So, there I was, walking into the woods, beside my house in the direction of the shack. Now, the shack was a few miles into the woods. It would be a while before I would get there. I got my phone and earbuds out of the bag that I had brought with me. I plugged my headphones in, went to my playlist, and selected the song My World by the Sick Puppies. And I just started singing along as I was walking. And after a few songs later, I was on a deer trail that I sometimes use when I was in these woods. And dark trees hung over my head, and a light flicker of lightning danced in between the falling autumn leaves. It was about to rain. As I took my earbuds out of my ears, the wind started to pick up, stripping the trees of more blood-red leaves. A few more minutes later, the wind died down, and a light drizzle started to fall from the sky. I was still in a good mood, however. Nothing was going to stop me from going on an adventure. Surprisingly, the rest of the walk was relatively relaxing. The rain stopped, and it turned into a calm evening. A few steps after looking at my phone's Google Map app, I heard an unusual cry, a shrill screeching that sounded similar to that of a fox. However, it had a baritone undertone to it, so I knew instantly it wasn't one. A little while later, I saw the tire that I saw when I first came across the shack, so I knew I was close. A few minutes passed, and I found an old gravel trail that was probably used as some sort of walkway when the house was lived in years ago. From there, the abandoned house came into view. I held up my mag light to the ancient structure. Just as I remembered it. Gray walls covered with dying ivy, a rusting tin roof, and warped glass windows. I walked up to the door, and I knocked first just in case, even though I knew it was vacant. I got no answer, so I grabbed the knob, slammed my body into the door to bust it open. And the wood was so old and rotted that it wasn't hard to break open, and I just walked in. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years, and I began looking around it. There was a stove in the kitchen, and a couch in the living room, and 3 other rooms. There appeared to be decayed food on the floor of the kitchen, and the smell just made me want to vomit, but I continued looking. I heard the sound of a twig breaking, but I brushed it off, thinking it was probably just an animal or that maybe I'd have stepped on something. So, I went into one of the 3 other rooms. It was a bedroom, and it was rather well maintained. The bed and closet were still there. The doors of the closet were still intact, although they had cracks in them. The house was surprisingly kept well on the inside. Maybe the decay of the outside hadn't touched the inside after all these years. It did smell really bad though, like an animal carcass on the side of the road. That moldy, earthy, mineral smell. Not that I go around smelling animal carcasses or anything, but there was this one time. Anyway, I digress. There was one thing that surprised me about the bedroom. There was a faded stain on the floor, and at the time I thought Well, the shack is old, so the roof probably leaks when it rains. So it was probably just a water stain. And the rust from the roof probably just stained it red. Just when I had that thought, I heard something walk into the house. I thought it was probably just another animal. But then I heard a faint cough. I knew instantly right then and there that it was a person. I freaked out and quietly got into the closet and gently closed the door. There was a horrible smell in the closet. I looked down, searching for the cause of the smell. There was a dead deer with its head cut off, and I really couldn't tell at the time, but something else was attached to it. I was stuck in there, and the silence was almost unbearable. It was so quiet that I could hear maggots writhing in the belly of the deer. I tried to keep calm and swallow the vomit that made its way into my throat, and that's when I heard the footsteps. It sounded like they weren't too far from the room that I was in. Whatever it was dragging something heavy, and I could tell that they were struggling by the way they were breathing and heaving. The footsteps and dragging noises finally came to a stop, only a few feet outside of the closet that I was hiding in. I heard it moan and heaved something onto the bed. The bed creaked with the weight placed on it. It took a little time, but I found a crack in the closet door, and I peeked through it to witness what I assumed was a body, but I couldn't really tell. It looked like human flesh with hair, but it was all mangled and distorted. It finally opened a hole right next to a hair patch and let out the same scream that I heard in the woods earlier. I gasped when I got to finally see the man next to this gelatinous flesh creature. He was a huge monstrosity of a man, with patches of hair missing from his head and a gigantic knife in his hand. He slowly raised the knife to his other arm and cut himself deep, screaming in agony as he did so. He raised his bleeding arm and flexed, blood squirting at the screeching mass of flesh on the bed. And suddenly, a blue veiny tongue stuck out of the creature on the bed, and it started to lick up the blood. The man that was standing beside the creature eventually collapsed, and that's when I decided to run out of there. I ran past the passed out man on the ground, not even bothering to look at the grotesque creature on the bed. I slammed through the front door and down the gravel path as fast as I had ever ran in my entire life. I eventually made it home running almost the entire time. I had marks and scratches on my face and hands where twigs and bushes hit me on the run back. And out of breath, I opened the back door to my house. And to my surprise, the police were sitting in the kitchen, talking with my mother. Apparently, my mom called my friend's house after trying to get a hold of me on my cell phone. My friend basically ratted me out, saying I wasn't with her, and my mom got really worried and called the police. I told them about the shack that I ventured out to, and they went out to check it. They found the shack, and they searched it, but they didn't find the man on the floor. or any creature, anything on the bed. They did find, however, a large amount of blood on the bed and a decaying deer corpse with a human head attached to it in the closet. They spent weeks at that shack in the woods behind my house, recovering 15 bodies altogether. They were everywhere in the rooms I didn't go into. They were in the walls. They were even under the floorboards. But all those bodies didn't scare me one bit. And perhaps I'm a bit of a psychopath for not being scared. Or perhaps I'm scared of that flesh monster and its blood bag, still roaming the woods behind my house.